There is in English an expression for crying out loud. And why would this appear here in the context of a webinar concerning children and alcohol? If you understand this why, you will understand much about the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Contrary to children with Down syndrome, which invariably are described as, in quotes, happy babies and are generally pleasant to live with, the children exposed to alcohol are the opposite. They cry a lot. They are generally unhappy. And if you remember this point, you will remember at least 50% of the burden imposed by the alcohol on the development of the temperament of a child. The neuropsychological impacts of alcohol are as important or even more important than the impacts we can see with our eyes, that is, physical impacts. Presented here is a short story about a long odyssey concerning alcohol and children. And the focal point is why it took so long to arrive to an understanding of the impact of alcohol on the development of so many children. This is an extract of a webinar, the first one of 4, concerned with alcohol and its impact on the unborn. The history of civilization and alcohol are intertwined. Here is depicted a clay tablet, which is a contract. It is about paying workers with beer because at the time drinking water was unsafe. Beer essentially was a way of drinking water since it was a very weak beverage where alcohol was less than 1%. The history of religions and alcohol are likewise intertwined, and here is shown the Last Supper, illustrating that drinking wine at those times was part of a well-served dinner. And as civilized people learned agriculture, how to harvest grains, they had to learn how to store them. And as they stored them, they discovered fermentation. And then they discovered that fermentation generated a spirit, vapors and contents of which changed the attitude of those that consumed it, which eventually then was called alcohol. And then a couple of thousand years later, humanity learned about enzymes, which caused the fermentation, which led eventually to the discovery of microbiology, bacteriology, that zygotes, human or otherwise, were fertile reproductive cells that had to do with zoology and zoo and animals and so forth. Alcohol and alcoholism, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and fetal alcohol syndromes have very complex faces, like a carousel of images. Let's look at some. By the time of the Roman civilization, which controlled most of the world, alcohol was used as a social lubricant in many occasions, including feasting. However, an important fact stands out, that those who got drunk were looked down upon. They were seen as despicable, people unable to control their spirit. So the pharmacological impact of alcohol, of a drug that inhibits inhibitions, was very well known to the ancients, but the impact on children was not, perhaps because abuse of alcohol was very limited. I added this image for the purpose of re-emphasis. We said the Romans diluted the wine with water to prevent ebriety. Here is an illustration of a vomitorium, a room where guests of these alcoholic feasts went to induce vomit as soon as they felt that ebriety or being drunk threatened their intelligence and social value. Who wants to talk to a demented drunk? So they just vomited the contents and went back to feast some more. All of that changed with the advent of the barbarians. Not only did they destroy whatever was on their path, they in fact were deeply ignorant, not capable of reading, much less of detecting the subtle effects of alcohol on their offspring. They met for what historians very politely call intense drinking or feast drinking. But the fact is that they were binging. They were drinking to get drunk. And this is an important concept because today that is one of the biggest challenges posed by alcohol on societies. The teenagers, the immature ones, get together, boys and girls, and they drink. They drink fast. They drink to get drunk. Sociologists tend to talk about patterns of alcohol consumption, very interesting points. But in the final analysis, from the point of the embryo and the point of view of the fetus, is the blood level that will be the cause and effect of alcohol on human maldevelopment. It is a matter of concentration in the drink consumed, how much concentration of alcohol is in this glass of wine, what is the volume that this individual will imbibe, and how quickly he would be swallowing this kind of beverage. So researchers very often cannot measure the blood level when somebody reports that they drink or they're drunk. But it's good to remember the scale of equivalence. One glass of beer is equivalent to one glass of wine and is equivalent to one serving of spiritual hard liquor. And much wisdom can be derived from human experience, humanism. For instance, Francis Scott Fitzgerald have this to say, and I think it's worth remembering. The first drink you take, then the drink takes a drink. You are in company, everybody's drinking, and so are you. Away to paradise lost. And then the drink takes you. You cease to be you. You are insane. You are unconscious. You are demented. And when the drink takes you, it also may take your children. And this extraordinary document, unique in my view, I never saw any other, shows that the consciousness of society, at least among artistic painters, was that indeed drinking alcohol had reproductive consequences. Here we see what I call asymmetric drinking. This man inducing binge drinking and this woman trying to seduce her. And the artist points out that she is fertile and she may be already pregnant or to become pregnant. And the artist does not stop at that. He shows the premature birth, which is lethal, particularly in that era. Binge drinking, embryonic death, fetal death. And if these poor creatures do not die, they are born damaged for life. That's what we call fetal alcohol spectrum disorders or syndrome. And here is one of those children taken by a mother who consumed alcohol in the company or alone of her husband. The fetal alcohol syndrome was recognized 300 centuries after other impacts of alcohol were recognized. Why such delay? Humanity knew a lot about alcohol impact on health and other matters, but not about the fetus. The first credible report was by Dr. Lemoyne from France. And unknown to American pediatricians, Dr. Christy Uliland observed fewer cases than Dr. Lemoyne. She informed her professor, Dr. David Smith, who then informed his fellow, Dr. Kenneth Jones, and they published several reports. These reports were similar and consistent with the findings reported by Philip Lemoyne. Dr. Lemoyne wrote an amusing fact. He stated, I studied 127 cases, whereas the Americans observed 8. My report was ignored, and their report was taken into consideration, was considered convincing. So I'm grateful to Dr. Smith for having had such influence on pediatrics not only in the United States, but in France and many other places. This underscores that it's not only what you see, but how do you communicate what you see. And that includes the parents, teachers, and other healthcare providers. There are two terms that the listeners should be aware of: fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Both concern 4 areas of maldevelopment. One is neurobehavioral, which is the most constant, and 3 more which can be documented, that is delayed growth, microcephaly or small head circumference, and dysmorphogenesis, that is major or minor malformations, distortions of morphogenesis of body parts. These 4 parts can be tightly connected and be concurrent, and that then will constitute the syndrome, or be loosely connected, that is, one patient will have one or the other or the other or the other, but they all will have neurobehavioral alterations that allow to suspect that they may represent the fetal alcohol damage. This webinar offers, I believe, a unique opportunity for the viewers to hear the director of the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, one of the largest health institutes established by the US government, because perhaps alcohol represents one of the largest drug addictions in the United States, an enormous problem. And Dr. Warren speaks of what are the aims of this institute, Why do they do what they do? And one of those aims is to find out which women may be exquisitely sensitive to alcohol in terms that no matter how little they drink, they may damage their embryo, and other women may be more resistant. These nuances are very important, and I think those who will listen to this master class will never forget it. Another master class is also included in the first webinar, and it is by Professor Claire Coles, who is an expert in neurobehavioral consequences of alcohol exposures before birth. Again, it is a presentation that is very unlikely for those who listen to it to forget. So this is the end of this trailer. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you see those who will follow.